So, with all that said, let's talk about the history of geographic information science. How did we get to where we are today? So I'm going to talk about ancient maps, early data collection methods, some of the first atlases, so the first compilations of geographic information, early development of spatial analysis techniques, how Canadian expansion is inherently linked to GIS. So GIS was actually invented in Canada. And then I'll wrap this up with just a little bit talking about applications, how GIS can be used as a tool for good, and how it's been used to harm people in the past. That's something that we have to be very cognizant of as GIS practitioners, is the power of the tools that we're using. We need to be conscientious of what we do with them. So GIS starts with cartography and surveying, so dating all the way back to the first maps. The first maps were rock art, pottery, and carvings. They were mostly landscapes, like showing hunting grounds, villages, agricultural plots. They're very diverse and pretty abstract. They don't necessarily look like maps that we use nowadays, but cartography actually evolved separately around the world on multiple occasions. The earliest sort of verifiable map that we have actually comes from the Czech Republic. It's engravings on a mammoth tusk that is used to actually map out a river system. So the different markings have different meanings, and they're used to basically show key points along a river. So it's a long linear tusk. It's pretty well suited to representing patterns and locations on a river. There are other examples. So this one from 10,000 years ago from Morocco is showing a landscape in a river valley. So you can see a river in the center and mountains along the left and right side. There's a more detailed map of a city, or not a city, a little town in Turkey from 8,700 years ago. And so the town can be seen in the foreground. All the different blocks represent buildings. And then in the background, you can see a volcano that was a feature on the landscape around the city. Moving up in time a little bit, in Italy, there's a 4,000-year-old engraving on a rock in a cave that shows the layout of a town. So you can see the little sketches of houses. They look quite similar to a sketch of a house you might do today, along with agricultural plots and animals and various little things. Some of the earliest advancements in mapping happened in Babylon. So that is the area that is present-day Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So they actually made portable maps, portable as in they were on stone tablets. They were quite heavy, or clay tablets rather. So they would create these clay blocks, and then they developed a system of writing, but they also expanded that to mapping. And so you could trace out maps on these clay tablets, and once they dried, they served as a permanent transportable record. And so, for instance, the example on the right is the Babylonian world map, and essentially it shows the capital in the center, and then radiating out from that are other communities on the different arrows. I just included this map because I think it's really cute. This was engraved on a rock about 2,000 years ago. It was just a small map that was created by farmers in Jordan to represent their the layout for their livestock pen. And so I think it's super adorable. The little stick figures look, you know, like something that you would draw today. So I don't know, it just provides a neat connection with the past, I think. But again, I don't want to just focus on areas that are perhaps classically covered. So Babylon is often talked about as the cradle of civilization, but mapping evolved separately around the world on numerous occasions. So in China, for instance, they created print screen maps on silk. And so the earliest surviving examples are from a little over 2,000 years ago, but it was probably occurring well before that. But so they printed maps on silk, and so those are obviously lighter, easier to transport than the Babylonian tablets, but they're also subject to decomposition and don't necessarily last as long. So, we don't necessarily have as old of an example of that. In Egypt, they printed maps on papyrus paper up to 3,000 years ago. But again, cartography also evolved separately in the Americas. So in South America, we have examples from maps created by the Incas that are over 2,000 years old. So the one on the left is a engraving on a rock that is pretty worn down and abstract and hard to see exactly, but essentially the town that this was in was at the center of the map, and then these lines radiating outwards represented connections to other towns and distances. And we see a cloth map, also from Argentina, from 2,700 years ago, and this represents agricultural plots. And then from closer to present, we see an example from Mexico from 500 years ago. So this was recorded sort of post-European contact, but it is representative of the mapping style that was used throughout Aztec civilization for many, many years. Unfortunately, many of the examples of historic cartography from the Americas were destroyed by the Europeans after contact. Looking a bit closer to home in North America, one of the coolest examples that I've come across is the Ojibwe people of Ontario and the surrounding regions used birch bark scrolls to map out canoe portages and river systems. So one especially noteworthy example. And so birch bark can be wrapped up into a scroll and easily transported. It's waterproof, it floats. It's a great thing to use for a canoe map. So this example actually represents the route all the way from the head of navigation of the Great Lakes system in Minnesota, all the way to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. So this is like thousands of kilometers that are represented on this birch bark scroll, and it's a really cool example. Another example on a rock in Idaho that represents the a sketching of the Snake River Valley system. And so again, you can see the linear feature that is the river kind of winding through, and then all the lands around it that were used for agriculture and hunting and things like that. Another really cool example, again, for water-based navigation. This one comes from Greenland. They used driftwood to carve out notches to represent key landmarks along the coastline. So each of the nodes on here represents an island, and you can use this to navigate. Again, it floats. It's great for navigating by kayak. And also, given that it's textural rather than purely visual, it can be used to navigate in dark or low light. One other really interesting, very abstract example that is quite different from what we're used to when we think of maps are Polynesian stick charts. So these were actually used to navigate the open ocean. Broad swaths of open ocean were covered by the Polynesians throughout the years, and there were often little to no visible landmarks to navigate by. Rather, Polynesians were very adept at navigating using wind patterns and wave patterns. And so they could actually lie down in their canoes and essentially figure out where they were based off the pitch and roll of the canoe as it bounced around in the waves. And so waves traveling over long distances in the ocean interact with islands, and that changes the actual angle at which these waves approach. And so they created these stick charts to represent the different wave patterns and wave directions. And so each of the little rocks that's tied to it represents an island. And then the sticks and the curves in them represent the directions in which the waves would travel relative to the island. So a really unique and interesting way to represent information. And so we are often presented mapping from strictly the European perspective, but I think it's very important to recognize and be cognizant of the fact that mapping actually evolved around the world separately on multiple occasions. So building on that, mapping required survey. The surveying tended to start with the construction of large structures, so either like monuments or agricultural fields. Some of the first surveyors were rope stretchers. Two examples, again, that originated completely separately, but basically did the same thing, are examples from the Olmec and Mayan culture, and then the Egyptians. And so people would stretch out lengths of rope to measure distances and angles, and so this was a way to systematize the collection of information. They used this for land ownership and agricultural surveys. That way they could collect information on crop yields and determine family inheritance, and also to lay out the boundaries of large structures like pyramids so that they could build them. Also important to that, figuring out bearing direction, is the compass. So the compass was actually invented at least twice, again, separately around the world. So you had the Olmec Society in Mexico discovered the compass around 3,000 years ago. And so they discovered that these magnetic bars would align themselves with a certain geometry. And so they mainly used these to align their structures with north, south, east, west, and a lot of this was used for astronomical purposes. There's no direct evidence that it was necessarily used for navigation, but that's not to say that it wasn't. And the compass also separately evolved during the Han Dynasty in China, so that was a little over 2,000 years ago. And so they had a slightly more elaborate system where they had a magnetic spoon that would, again, orient itself following north. And so, again, initially this was used to orient and align buildings, but as time progressed, it began to be used for navigation. That started up in China around 1,000 years ago and made its way to Europe by about 800 years ago. Some other tools, again, ropes are nice for measuring distance, but when you're trying to measure angles and measure distances over long sections, it's better to use tools that work based on line of sight. And so again, these tools also evolved separately around the world. So these tools allowed us to measure bearings, distances, elevations, and sizes. And so you have various examples. I have various examples of sighting mechanisms here. One is from ancient Rome. It's called a Gormatici, and it was used to survey the road system. The Incans had a very similar tool that they used to survey and measure out their road system. And in China, a similar system was used, and here's actually an example of how it was used to measure the size of islands off the coast from a vantage point on the coastline. So there's a whole book written about that. And so specifically talking about the Gormatici, the Roman Empire employed professional surveys because they had a massive road network that stretched all across the empire. They also used it for an agricultural land registry, and they used it to do some urban planning. So here's a map, early GIS, of a city and how they used it to plan it out. If you're interested, there's a link here. You can watch a short little video on how the Gorma actually works.